This morning we are hosted by Pani Irena Tomaszewska at her lovely apartment in Ottawa. And as part of our project Memory Archive, Pani Irena agreed to tell us a bit on her personal history. You were born in Siberia.
I was born actually west of Siberia. I was born in Russia itself, in a camp called Rosohi, which was not far from Arkhangelsk.
So that's north.
Very far north, very far north.
How can a Polish baby be born in Arkhangelsk?
Well, this baby was conceived in Poland and only born there 3 months after my mother was deported. My parents, my whole family, was deported by the Russians.
The baby was conceived before the beginning of the World War II?
Actually, considering I was born in May, I would say right around the start of the war. Because I was born in May, towards May 20th. My mother was 6 months pregnant when they were arrested by the Russian soldiers and put on trains and sent off to the far north.
And your mother, your parents, they managed to keep you alive, even though the temperature outside was probably minus something.
Yes.
Even though there was a scarcity of food and scarcity of everything.
Actually, yes. Well, I do know this, because although obviously I remember nothing, but I come from a talkative family. So we talked about it. I, being the youngest, actually listened a lot because I had very little to contribute about this, if anything. And but I was very curious all my life. So later on, I had many discussions with my mother, and I was very curious about how all this happened. I do know that very, very few children under 2 survived this camp, which is probably true of all the camps that Russia had. A lack of food, cold, just dreadful conditions. How I did it, who knows? When I was born, at this point my father was still with them. Later on he was taken away. But at this point he was still with them. And actually they were concerned as to what shape I'd be in when I was born, because for the last 3 months of her pregnancy, she was already very often starving. And she was also expected, when they got there, to go out and chop trees, that being the strange system at the time. So, but nevertheless, I was born, and of course, parents can be prejudiced, but they said I was perfect. We surprised them.
Like all their children, like both of your sisters, you were there together and you survived because you were perfect.
Well, but they must have been perfect too, because they survived too. However, this is how it went, but we were there for quite a long time, and I've often asked, I mean, clearly my mother couldn't nurse me because a starving woman simply would not have the milk to feed a child. How it was all done, it was, taking some dark bread and putting into some liquid and then squeezing that into my mouth. I mean, it's almost bizarre. I should not have survived. But very, very few children under 2 did, and newborns were pretty well doomed. But there I was. And then my father was taken away to a harsher camp, and we were not sure. I'm not sure where. That will come out later. We talked a lot about things, but in a specific way that I think was very much our own. And so Mother stayed on. Of course, she had to go back and work in the forest.
And how old were your sisters at that time?
My oldest sister was 7 when I was born. and Wanda was 5 or 6. Well, Helena was probably 8, because they lied about her age.
Okay.
At a certain age, she would have been taken away to be sent to a school.
So they lowered.
So they lied about it and made her younger.
Uh-huh.
So she is to this day 7 years older than I am. And Wanda was 2 years older than Helena. And there was a school in the camp, nevertheless. So they were taught about how dreadful Poland was and how stupid God was and how Russia was perfect. And they went there. Helena went there, she said, quite happily, because that's where they got a bowl of porridge when they got there. Wanda enjoyed the porridge too, but Wanda, who was younger, really objected to the lessons. Okay. And one time she argued, this is a 6-year-old, argued with the teacher and told her you were lying, and she ran away from school. They had a hard time finding her, and it was very cold. They finally found her near frozen. She was sick with pneumonia. She recovered more or less, but she ended up with tuberculosis. And so when my mother later on had to find her way down to the Caspian Sea, to the army of Anders, she was carrying me because I still could not walk. I had rickets, and she had to carry Wanda much of the time because Wanda was very ill. And Helena, brave Helena, was, apart from having one ear permanently damaged from an ear infection that, of course, had no treatment, she carried our little, you always had to carry something to hold water, something, so she was the carrier. And somehow we all made it out.
And your family was reunited. Your father survived.
He did.
This harsher camp, and you all ended up getting out of the Soviet Union.
We did, in a very. We didn't get out altogether. My father found his way to the Anders Army on his own, from wherever he was. And we did it our way, with my mother with the 3 children. We went via Kazakhstan, but nevertheless, I should say, my parents were totally fluent in Russian, almost like a first language.
How come?
They always told me because that's how it was where they lived. They lived in what is now Belarus. Everybody spoke Russian, Polish. My mother spoke Ukrainian. Both of them could speak Ukrainian, which was a godsend because eventually, much later, my mother did translation for the government. Okay. So it was nice work. But they just did. They went to, well, my father was born in 1902. There were no Polish schools.
No. Schooled in the Russian school.
So they went to Russian school. A couple of his older brothers studied in Russian. My father was younger. He went to university at the University of Poznan. His younger sister at the University of Warsaw, and became an economist. But on my mother's side, they weren't in a position to send their children to university, but they became teachers, things like that. But they, again, she was the youngest, but they spoke Russian at home because of a mystery that I have not yet solved. Her father, she used to say, well, he was Georgian. Well, he was Georgian. He didn't speak Georgian. When he went to Poland from Georgia, he didn't say he went to Poland. He said he came back to Poland. So why did he go away? But now we can't put the pieces.
You can't trace
we
it
can't
back,
put the pieces together.
As you, I'm sure you know that after the November uprising.
Yes, of course.
Uprising, lots of people were either deported or they went
Oh, yes,
to
yes.
Russia.
And actually, Georgia, quite a few. There were a lot of Poles in Georgia. So he came back. But by that time, it was maybe a couple of generations later. So by that time, Russian was really his first language, although he spoke some Polish. So he came back, but he married a Polish girl. But they spoke Russian at home. And
But
then...
in terms of their identity, even though they spoke Russian at home, did they... What do you know about their
Well,
self-definition?
I do know, first of all, they were not Roman Catholic.
Okay.
They were Greco-Catholic or Orthodox of some sort. I know that her oldest sister, and it was a big age gap, her oldest sister actually taught in a Russian school in a church, because that's what existed. And I also know that she was also married to a teacher who also taught in Russian. And as soon as Poland became independent, they passed their exams in Polish and started teaching in a Polish school. So, and also briefly during the First World War, they were evacuated, is the word, because the Russians were still in charge. They evacuated people to the east, especially people who were familiar with Białowieża, because those people would be too useful to the Germans.
Right.
So they were evacuated to the east. But when the revolution started and the war was coming to an end, they of course they went home. So they went home, except for two brothers. One went missing, not to be found again, until Khrushchev permitted him to write home to let his family know where he was. He had been swept up somewhere during the revolution, sent up to work around Murmansk, and in Russian style, he was released after a few years. But Russian style meant you're released, but you can't leave. But you can't leave, or communicate with your family. But he married another Polish prisoner while he was up there. Nevertheless, except for that letter that he was permitted to write in 54, 5, mid-50s, when Stalin was gone and Khrushchev allowed it. And then we don't know anything more about him. The other brother that went missing was actually a very interesting thing, because he went missing voluntarily. He was younger. As he's remembered by my mother, when he was a student, he was quite active. He was socialist. But when they were evacuated to Russia, that revolution appealed to him.
Oh, so he joined the...
Well, he must have, but everybody lost track of him. Nobody knew what happened to him until many years later, when they discovered, oh my goodness, he's a historian at the University of Moscow.
Oh, really? So
And
he turned into like a Russian...
well,
citizen?
a Soviet citizen who did quite well. In fact, very well, because after he obviously taught history. He wrote history books. Bzdury, my cousin told me.
Yes, bullshit,
Bzdury, my cousins told me. But when my parents were deported, and after my father left, my mother, by that time, knew that actually, they knew about him, that he had become the rector of the University of Moscow. Interesting position.
So she managed to reach out to him?
Well,
right?
she wrote him a letter, and in that magnificent way that I know about from reading so much history, because this is all about Poland, by the way, all of it. So, letters get around. They're unsigned. He received it. And some months later, she received an unsigned note saying, don't get in touch with me again.
Oh, jeez.
So, as I tell you later, my parents were either incapable of holding grudges or just refusing to pass them on. When she told me about this, she said, you know, really, he would have just ended up in a camp himself. And so would his family.
Right.
So
he wrote it. One would love to believe that he wrote this predominantly, first of all, to protect himself and his family, not to put
that's what my mother preferred to believe. You know, we're going all over in time zones here, because I might as well finish with my good old Uncle Ilya. Because many years later, he died, of course, as people do, and his daughter discovered a manuscript written do szuflady.
Okay.
So he did write about he never ever let anyone know about his Polish connection. It would not have been an advantage. He didn't want to have Polish family. So he didn't. But in his manuscript, he did. It was written in Russian. I once paid someone about $500 to translate just one section for me, and then I lost it. But my cousins have it. I should get it again. But that was very interesting because it described his childhood a bit. It was a family that was actually not at all wealthy. They had a farm, but he also had to work. And he was a gajowy.
Okay, so like a forest.
But a foreman, just like a foreman. But they also had a farm that they produced their own food. It sounded so much like an American pioneering story. Produced their own food. They grew flax. My grandmother could weave. She made all the clothes. All the children went to school, but that's because they were extremely hardworking.
And was it near Białowieża? Or
it was around Białowieża, Hajnówka, there. And by the time they came back, well, actually, by the time they left, they owned their house. They were not tenants, and my grandfather even had bought another one that he was renting. So to me, it was a very American pioneering story.
Quite successful in a way.
Which is how I don't often hear this kind of story from Poles, and I don't know whether it's they don't know it, because if people come from that part of the world, they'll say, well, we come from a village. And this is it. Well, nobody just comes from, I don't believe people do nothing. But anyway, this is what happened.
What a story. But your earliest memories
My earliest
are related to a completely different
Yes.
continent.
Yes.
Your childhood is
In Tanzania.
how come?
Well, because my mother finally made it to the Caspian Sea via Kazakhstan and so on. My father had already done so, and being the army, they were transported separately. But my mother managed to get all three of us on one of those barges across the Caspian to Iran, where
Persia, right?
Persia.
That time
Yeah,
it was
we always called it Persia. It's a much prettier name. And there, Wanda was taken to a hospital, of course, because the doctors felt she would not survive. My mother spent as much time as possible with her and put Helena and me into an orphanage. I have a photograph of Helena and me in this orphanage with a nurse and with my mother holding me. She came to visit us. Again, this sounds like a sad story. I never heard it as a sort of sad story. All of this was always told in a very matter-of-fact way, and with a sense of accomplishment, perhaps. I don't know, as my mother wasn't capable of feeling sorry for herself, I think.
I think she set up her priorities.
Yes, absolutely.
The child that was very sick at that time
Of course.
was for her a top priority.
Of
and
course.
She did everything she could to support
Of
this
course.
child.
Wanda
that
could
had
not
to
die
be-
alone if she died.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And given the fact that the oldest one was at that time, what, like 9?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
She could look after the youngest, meaning
And
you.
she did, and she
And
did.
the two of you were under good care
Yeah.
of professional
Yes.
personnel with other children.
Yeah.
You were safe.
Yes, and mother visited us every day. Every day she would come. And Helena, my older sister, Helena, did tell me that I was a pretty good baby, partly because it took me a while to walk, even though I was 2, because I had rickets. So my bones were not, anyway. But I eventually recovered, of course, and started walking. So I wasn't hard to look after. She was always happy when I went to sleep. But also she said what she really wanted to do was to go out and join the children her age who were getting chocolates from the British and American soldiers. It was fun, and it was fun. The soldiers were good to them. They had. And I think in Tehran, the Poles already started schools. So
Halina would go.
So she would go, but somehow it all worked out. I mean, you know, to get every detail, this is as much as I could. But it all worked out, and it was, and, you know, and as for the journey down, I only know the stories about it from Helena, Wanda, and my mother.
Your mother and your 2 sisters, at a certain point in time, you traveled from Persia to Tanzania.
And then, yes, and the way that happened was, once Wanda recovered enough, we went to India to a camp with the funny name called Country Club. I think it was a nickname, but everybody called it Country Club. It's Country Club in the various history books I've found. And it was a transit camp, because there we had to wait for a ship to take us to Tanzania, and ships had to wait for a convoy because they couldn't just sail by themselves. But there they already had schools, and Helena had started schools. They had cultural, I mean, I tell you, it's not for nothing. I have fantastic admiration for Poles, for the Polish people, because I have everything I heard, but also read, because I have to add that later on, after all this, my curiosity meant that I had to find out, how did all this happen? My family's stories were not enough. Well, they were in a way. I believed everything. Why not? But it had to have a context. There had to be something. So I wanted to know more. And after 3 months in 3 months in Tehran, 3 months in India, and then came the ship with the convoy to take us to Mombasa was the port. And again, I don't remember that. My mother had a funny way of telling me about everything later on. She, as I said, she didn't have this, even the saddest stories were told with a certain achievement, and also she was always observant.
Sort of like cheerful way.
Well, more
positive.
not positive, and also she would then tell me, "Oh, Irene, the desert was so beautiful. You've never seen the desert, the mountains, the rivers." She always saw where she was, no matter what was happening, and she would tell me about it. And this has been years, later, because we always had great conversations. Mom and I spent a lot of time together, just the 2 of us, because of the age difference.
Yes, because your 2 sisters were...
Yeah, they went off to school and so on, and so Mom and I talked a lot, forever. And I was fascinated by all this. So I started reading and so on, and so anyway, this ship took us to Mombasa. From there, we were on a train. And again, my sister, the children who were older, I mean, these children came from Poland. and they were suddenly on the Indian Ocean. They saw flying fish. They saw the most amazing things. And children being children, they saw them. So they got to Mombasa. The train took them to Arusha. But the train had to go across the Serengeti. So once again, I mean, no matter how sick they were, and of course so many of them were orphaned, but they were looking at...
Experienced a lot of tragic moments.
Yes, but there were...
Surrounded by this.
They were looking out the window of the train. There were zebras and elephants and giraffes. You know, what can you do? So they get to Arusha. And in Arusha, a funny thing happened. I forgot to mention that the 3 months in Tehran and 3 months in India, my mother picked up some English.
Okay.
Not great English, but just a little bit of English. She had obviously been speaking to doctors and officials and so on. So in Arusha, when our particular shipment of refugees arrived, there were doctors to meet us. One notable doctor was called Dr. Saska. He was a Hungarian with a fascinating history of his own, and he came with his wife and this I don't know to this day. Did he volunteer to come? Did the Polish government arrange it? The British? Who knows? But he was there. But he was such a good man, kind man, that I have a feeling he was there, and his wife, to help with children, for him to examine the more seriously ill people. And so he did, and Wanda was among the more seriously ill because she was not fully recovered from her tuberculosis. By that time I was walking and eating and so on. So we were taken to one of our huts. And Dr. Saska said, I'll be back in a week and I'll come to check up on Wanda. So they came back, and Mrs. Saska came with him, and she came and she chatted with my mother's broken English. And then there was a third visit, and once again the same thing. And in that third visit, Mrs. Saska said to Mother, how would you like some private English lessons? You know, your English is pretty good, but it won't improve here if you don't hear English. Well, would my mother say, no, how in the devil do you get to Arusha from Tengeru? There's no public transit. But she just said, well, of course I would like some. We'll arrange it. We'll come and get you. We have a friend, an English friend. Her husband recently died, and she's a widow with not enough to do.
So she will be
and she will be your English teacher. It will do her good, and it will do you good. Who's going to say no? So anyway, my mother said, of course, I'd like to. And they kept their word. They came, and they took all three of us. I have photographs of their house, their garden. I have wonderful, happy memories of their house.
This is something you remember either through the photos or because
memory too, because I was there until the age of 8, after all. So, you know, I remember the Saskas very well. He was a doctor. I mean, he treated me now and then. I had some kind of tropical fungus on my head. I remember that he treated me for that. And I remember Mrs. Saska, and she used to give us, well, when my sisters were at school, sometimes I would go, they would be in Hartserstfon, and they had friends. So sometimes I would go visit them with my mother alone. And what's a little girl to do all by herself? Well, I was used to being by myself.
In a way, you were in some disadvantageous position because you were younger, so you could not join. You were not able to join your sisters. But on the other hand, you accompanied your mother.
Yes.
And
in Arusha.
And you benefit from both.
That, and I did. And Mrs. Saska, you know, they didn't have toys. Nobody. But she would give me clothes to dress up in, and I was permitted now and then to bring my one and only friend from Tengeru, who was an orphaned girl who did not live in the orphanage. She was looked after by Pani Rossellini, who had taken care of her after her mother died in Russia. And Gija was my only friend, and we got together now and then.
You were living at that time in Tengeru, but traveling to Arusha?
Whenever, you know, it could be arranged. But my mother's English lessons were so successful that within a few months she got a job as the school secretary because she could read and correspond and talk to the British officials. That there was some interaction. There had to be. I mean, it was, yeah, although the Tengeru was actually governed, if you want to put it that way, by Polish authorities, but it was British, a British colony. I mean, they did it. So there did have to be correspondence, and she did have to type up reports and do all kinds of things. So she got that job, and I have a lovely picture of her at her office as well. And
and you have, of course, recounted the Tengeru histories many times. There are recordings of you or other students from Tengeru. So, with your permission, we will skip this part.
Sure, if you like.
And just to recap, you stayed in Tengeru in Tanzania at the children's camp for a couple of years with your mother and your 2 children.
6 years.
6 years, so that was 1943.
2 to 48.
Okay, but at that time, of course, your mother spoke to you in Polish.
Of course.
You all knew that you were Polish. You were all surrounded by this Polishness. But I presume that at that time you also picked up some English.
No, oddly enough, I wasn't. As I said, I didn't have little friends. So I did hear the adults speak, but only when we went visiting the Saskas, because we didn't hear English spoken in Tengeru. And they didn't really include me. Nobody really paid that much attention. They were kind to me. They gave me things to do, and I wasn't demanding. I don't know. That's how it was.
At that time
was in
with the Polish army.
Yes, and I forgot to tell you this, which I think is, I always found it wonderful. Neither one of them knew whether the other had survived, of course. How could they know?
So your mother
got to Persia, and my father got to Persia, and then, of course, the army went through fairly quickly to Iraq. But in Tehran, the Polish forces very quickly set up a little newspaper. And in the newspaper were all kinds of news, including who was where and stuff like that. And my mother wrote a poem, actually about me, in Rosochyn, and it was published in one of these newspapers. And here's, the story as my family told it to me. And my father, of course, all the soldiers were picking up this. Everybody was picking them up because this is news. And my father picked up, and it was signed Anna Tomaszewska. Not an uncommon name, but he certainly recognized the style. And so the story is he saw it and he said, they made it. Whatever, I don't know how you say they made it in Polish anymore. But anyway. Yeah. Przeżyły. Przeżyły.
Yes, speaking about your father, the chair you're sitting on. Tell us, how is this piece of furniture related to your father? It's a very particular chair.
It's a very particular chair. My father was, he wasn't a youngster, when he finally got in the army.
He was in his early 40s.
Well, he was born in 1902. So, but he was a university graduate, so he became an officer. I don't know whether he had ever been in the reserves. I don't know. He was a forestry engineer. That was his profession, nadleśniczy. So he became a lieutenant, and I had to have his military record. I wrote away for it. He was in Łączność? Something. Yes. And so he traveled with the army, of course. So when the army was sent from the Middle East to Italy, he went with them. So a lot of the officers, this chair comes completely apart. It has no nails on it well, this is sort of, but you know, you can just pull this leather strap out, and then it all folds up. Everything comes apart, folds up, and it fitted into a little duffel bag about this long, and it was like this.
So he was able to carry this.
So
wherever he went.
they took these chairs with them, and there are photographs in some books I have of General Anders sitting in a chair like this, and even Churchill. And Churchill was a fat man, but he was sitting in one of these too.
Maybe they had a special chair for Winston
They
Churchill.
may. I should look in the book
thicker,
again. They may have got
thicker
something like that. But when in 1994 I was working as a researcher for a documentary being made for CBC called A Web of War. And among other things, this was a work by Brian McKenna, who liked to dramatize a few scenes. So he was planning to dramatize a scene with General Anders. He got an actor to play him. And then the crew got in touch with me, or whatever they are, and do you know where we could get one of those chairs? And I said, as a matter of fact, I do, but the canvas is torn. We'll fix it for you. You're welcome. So the canvas has been repaired. Compliments of
So
CBC.
the canvas is repaired or new, but
The frame is indestructible.
Yeah.
And as it turned out, that scene never made it into Web of War because it was a very unrealistic thing.
This scene will definitely make to the recording. I can assure you.
Good. So now it has been, so it'll be immortalized. The film was kind of funny. It was the film was supposed to be, you know, Poland in World War II, in a 1-hour documentary, which on commercial TV means 50 minutes, which is a farce.
No, of course.
But I said, you can't do it. So obviously, poor General Anders ended up being cut out. The entire Navy was removed from the story, which broke my heart because I interviewed Admiral Tomaszewski in Toronto, for heaven's sakes.
The one who commanded Ślązak.
Yes. And he was the most elegant, he and his wife, the most elegant people in the world. I mean, she was, and their most romantic story, they told me.
But that didn't make it to the film.
But it didn't make it into the film, and so much didn't, because...
Let's try to come back to Admiral Tomaszewski later. But now, let's go back to 1948.
48.
And when your mother and your two daughters, you leave Africa, you move out to...
Well, we all have to leave. Independence for Africa is coming. The Brits are losing their empire. They know it. So we had to, anyway, we all wanted to be reunited. But I should add this. For my sisters who were in school, and the schools in Tengeru were fantastic.
Polish schools.
Yes, Polish schools, run by the Polish government in exile. It was their school system. And they were excellent. And the children were imbued with, they had so much fun in Tengeru because it was freedom, it was adventure, it was everything that children need. But the schools were, they didn't have to be that strict because you're going to go home, you're going to go back to Poland, and you will be rebuilding Poland. Can you imagine this kind of motivation for young people? They were so inspired. This is what we're going to do.
We are learning here not only for ourselves, but we are learning for Poland.
Well, but patriotism was one part of it. But I think from a psychological point of view, how important they were. You know, we are going important elements of this story, and I think that's important because I think humility and obedience are only good for so far. You know, I think it's a little bit good to have the other stuff.
Yeah, but you need to have some internal motivation.
Well,
even if there are
and also self-esteem and self-confidence and things like that. So I don't know exactly when they were told about Yalta. I mean, I know in general from history books when the news was out, but they're different people at different times. But I don't know when the children were told. But clearly my mother was corresponding with my father, and they were, you know, eventually.
Your father at that time was already in the UK.
He was, well, not immediately. After the war ended early in Italy, as you know, and of course the Polish government immediately started schools because of the interrupted. So many of the soldiers had interrupted schooling in 1939. And actually, my father taught Latin.
Because as a forester, he must have had some Latin.
Well, actually, in those days, every university graduate had Latin. Actually, my father could speak Latin, never mind read it or write it, because they could.
Classical education?
It was a classical education, and you know, forestry. So he taught Latin after they were demobilized, but still in Italy. And they were corresponding. And the refugees in Africa were really put off till the end, because whereas the Polish refugees, displaced persons in Europe, those were heartbreaking scenes. They were from camps, from, you know, dreadful trauma.
Slave labor, forced labor.
Everything. And it was just, well, they were a priority. In Africa, well, as one Canadian official put it when he went down to have a look at the African camps, he was almost disgusted. He said, "We'd hardly call them refugees. They're having a Polish party, Polish party in the heart of Africa." He was appalled at the way we were dressed. I'll have to show you some pictures. We were bloody well dressed. And I remember asking my mother once, when you got there, how do you get going again after all that horror of Russia? What got you started? She said, well, you start with good dressmakers. Well, what else are you supposed to say? You know, you don't feel, you have to look good to feel good. It goes together.
Even though you're a refugee,
it goes together.
You start every day washing up.
And you get dressed, and you get dressed and you go to work. And the children, all the school kids, every one of them, they didn't wear uniforms to school, but they had the girls had white dresses with sailor collars, every one of them. When I think that all those women in Africa had to iron with an iron that had coal in it, but when we got dressed for a special occasion, it was a scene. It was a scene, and then the boys would have the khaki shorts and a white shirt. And, I mean, it was all of that, and we were healthy. And so that was an observation by one who, a DP, well, you know what that DP stands for. A DP was a DP. What were they doing looking like this? So another Canadian official had to respond to this and said, well, surely after 6 years in the wonderful climate of Tengeru, you would be disappointed if they were still in ashes and rags. You know, what a silly thing to, but that's attitudes. So that's what happened. Anyway, so eventually we were looked at, and there was a ship available to take us to England.
So you did not arrive in Canada directly?
No, no.
You spent some time in England.
And there I met my father. Well, he had met me, but, you know, I didn't remember the meeting. So I met my father for the first time at the age of 8, and I was lucky. He was an awfully nice man. So things went well. When we got there, well, of course, I'm sure that my parents corresponded about this. Unfortunately, we don't have the letters. We moved many times in Canada, too. So I don't have the correspondence, but I did pick up the story later on. I don't know, in England provided the Polish veterans that fought with them with camps to resettle for a while, temporary camps. There were those things called, what, Quonset huts, those barrel-shaped things, where people would, you know, curtain off certain sections for families. But while my father was waiting for us, he had met and been befriended by a couple of people, an Anglican vicar and his wife. And he visited them a lot, and they were very sympathetic. Of course, the English knew what the Polish war record was, and although their gratitude didn't last long, nevertheless, a great many of them did know, and how it all turned out. And they were very sympathetic. And one thing about my father is how they felt about Yalta, they didn't imbue us with bitterness. We knew about it. I found out actually by reading Churchill. Because, I don't know, it was just my parents decided it was all over. I mean, they knew they couldn't go back. So it was not to forget what we were, who we were. We talked about these things, but we knew we couldn't go back. And the idea, I mean, my father, while waiting for us, could see the veterans together. And after the betrayal, there's nothing, no other way to call it. It was a betrayal and a terrific injustice.
Realpolitik or
yes,
yeah,
but there was an injustice, and the trauma, I think, on the veterans must have been even greater than their memories of, at least they were fighting for a cause. And what he saw was that they couldn't stop talking about it. They would get together, very often get together, and with a little bit of...
And reminiscent on the past or the
betrayal, the sorrows, the tragedy, the what to do, what have we lost? And, well, very often, and maybe sometimes drown your sorrows as well. And he chose not to. No, we're going to do it differently. It's over. He took every course he could because he didn't know what kind of a job. I think it's funny, I see his certificates for bookkeeping, for shoe repair, for all kinds. He prepared himself for whatever.
He had a responsibility,
yeah.
a wife and 3 children, and quickly enough, good for him, he realized that as a soldier, decommissioned soldier, he won't be able to provide.
And he was 40-something. Right. He was in his mid-40s.
Even more impressive.
Not an attractive age for immigrants. So when he was expecting us to come finally, he knew that our ship was going to come, this vicar had suggested him in the meantime, why don't you go and live in Hatherley? It's a little town, because they were in Oakhampton at this point. Go to Hatherley. It's a very nice little town. I know the headmaster of the school there. I'll get in touch with him. Your children will be very well treated. So he took my father to Hatherley. My father found rooms that we could rent from a Mr. and Mrs. Crocker, who had a little girl my age, as it turned out, and we rented the rooms. And indeed, Mr. Brown, the headmaster of the school, was waiting for us and took extraordinary good care of us. He made sure that we were well placed, that they wouldn't do what so often the English will do. If you don't speak English well, clearly you have to go back in school. You know,
but in your case, that
no. Mr. Brown said, no, you will learn English with your peers. And I'm sure you'll do fine. And we did. We all did very well. We all passed. So that was arranged that way. And Mrs. Brown even gave my sister piano lessons, and we visited them a few times. We were introduced to English folk songs and got to love them. And we enjoyed the school year very much. And one funny thing was one day, not one day, very early on, the first week at school, we came home and informed my parents of a very strange English thing. They have school on Sundays here. My parents said, well, If so, then
Be it.
then you'll have to go to school. We said, all right. So Sunday came, we got dressed to go to school. We're walking down High Street, and we see our friends, and everybody's all dressed up. Hats and gloves and special dresses. And
You're not.
and they say to us, where are you going? And we said, where are you going? Sunday school. Oh, well, we're going to school. They said, well, no, come with us. Sunday school is not a school.
Yeah, Sunday school
So we
is
said,
something
all right.
different.
So we went with them, and we discovered it's in the church. So we got there, and the adults went to church, and the kids went to Sunday school. And we didn't understand a word they were saying at this point. Not that it would have mattered. It was Bible studies or something. And at the end, slowly, the teacher explained, you're welcome anytime. If you prefer not to come, this is not an obligation. It's not like school. So we went home, informed our parents, and parents left it up to us. And we definitely preferred a day off.
And this is something that you personally remember, of course.
Oh, yes, I remember that very well. We all said no. Sunday school wasn't all that interesting. There was no Catholic church nearby. Oakhampton was too far away. We had no car. My father had a bicycle. He did commute to Oakhampton on a bike for his things. But overall, the English were friendly. We were happy there. We had no strange encounters. Everybody respected us. When many years later, when my son was 18, he had just finished a second year maybe at McGill, maybe first year. He took his bike and went to England with his bike. And he had got the address of Hatherley, and he decided to go there and find Ford House, Oakfield Road in Hatherley. Went there. The houses didn't have numbers, names. He found Ford House, knocked on the door, and said he was looking for Mr. and Mrs. Crocker. The lady said, oh, well, they have died, but their daughter lives, I don't know where. Go to the post office. They'll tell you. So he went to the post office, and he said, I'm trying to find anyway, you know the story. What he was looking for. And the postman, who was an older man, said, the Polish family, what lived with the Crockers? And Pierre said, yes.
Yes, it's my mother's family.
And the postman said, stay right here. I'm going to phone Jennifer right now. He called Jennifer. Jennifer and her husband came racing down in their car, took Pierre to the place, and he said, I could hardly get away from them. They kept me for 3 days, and I wanted to ride my bike all around England.
But they
So this is the England I know.
Their hospitality.
I know the other England. I am.
Yeah, we have heard some different stories.
Oh, and
about
I'm familiar with
England.
them. I think this is what my father wanted also to shield us from. Because it didn't take long there's nothing like, we want our jobs back. Why don't you go home? And this certainly happened. But in the meantime,
Somehow Canada appeared on the
yes, but they were looking at Australia, looking at Argentina, but my father was in his mid-40s. I don't know if you know this, but Canadian immigration back then there was no immigration department. Immigration was handled by the Department of Mines and Forests. Tells you everything about the policy. So the young men had no problem. Young women.
In the case of your father, it's forests.
But something else happened that was magnificent. Before the Second World War, these immense forests in Canada were big grants of land would be given usually to some politician's friend. That's how it worked.
For exploitation.
For exploitation, yes. But it was very political. So, but these lumber kings, this is how they ended up being called. They were lumber kings. because they exploited it. They cut it and moved on, got back in touch with their politician friends, said, got another grant of land for us. There was no concept of sustainable forestry. But no, the concept was there, but it just wasn't put in practice. But there were a few people who thought about it. During the war, there was an act of parliament saying as soon as the war is over, every forestry company has to have a forestry engineer. They have to employ one, and we have to put in sustainable forestry. You have to not just cut, but you have to do reforestation.
So that was an opportunity.
So that was...
matched your father's expertise, qualifications.
That was when my father got a letter from someone. Again, there are complications, and it was such a long story. But nevertheless, we did know someone, actually a priest who was in Africa and knew the family and wrote and said. And so my father got a job offer from a lumber king in the Algonquin Park. And it was like another miracle. So, of course, he signed the contract because that made our entry into Canada possible. And the English, God bless them, once an officer, always an officer. They sent us here first class on the Empress of France. I love the English class system, don't you?
Yes, because your father finished his military career with the rank of lieutenant colonel.
No, he never went beyond lieutenant. He was not an army man. And he was in won't, whatever, I can't pronounce it. But no, as a lieutenant, you're an officer. Yeah. And they did, that's how it worked. I think it still does. Anyway, so we came here on the Empress of France, and this is where the beautiful story takes a sharp turn to the left. Oh dear. Because Canada was not, what can I say? I mean, rural Ontario, we found it also backward and it was, so anyway, but I don't know how to cut it to make it not too long, but the lumber king, of course, I'll give you can live out, somewhere around Algonquin Park. Yes, but where are the schools? Where's the something?
Yeah, you're like in the middle of almost nowhere.
Well, nowadays
Oh, nowadays it's different.
People would talk about Kashubi. Of course, Kashubi then
didn't exist.
It's as pretty as it is. Well, it existed, but they didn't even realize they were Kashubians, I think. But the thing is, there was a one-room schoolhouse somewhere, and then what? And my parents said, no, this won't do. So we had to live somewhere, and well, Barry's Bay was around, but they didn't seem to care for that. So they went to Pembroke, which was a dismal little town, but it was a town. And then we learned a few things about Canada, which is interesting social history. When they came here, on our records in those days, your religion as well as your ethnic origin was marked. So we were Roman Catholic. So they discovered in Pembroke that there was a Protestant school, there was a Catholic school, and the two are not the same quality. And actually the Protestant schools were public schools, but everybody called them Protestant in those days. So since we were Catholics, they assumed we had to go to Catholic school. But it was very well known, they're not the same quality. But there was a convent, which was a private school for girls. There was also a private school for boys. So my parents, what do? You work hard and you send your kids to the convent. So they did. So all three of us went to the convent, the school was right next to the cathedral in Pembroke.
And it was like all-girls school?
That all-girls school, with black uniforms, stiff collars, long sleeves. Can you imagine this to three little Polish Africans? It was unbelievable. I mean, we couldn't believe it, but that's how it was. But there's a nice side to the nuns.
And it was a boarding school?
No, you didn't have to board, no. No, we would have if we'd stayed in Algonquin Park, but you know, parents don't send their kids to boarding school after 6 years of separation. No. So they moved to Pembroke, and we lived, and so we went. But there's an interesting story about the nuns, because really my mother had to. We lived actually in the worst possible part of town, sort of a shanty town of tar paper, little tiny houses. There was actually one house on our street that did not have a floor. It was an earthen floor. They had a ladder that went up to a platform, and the family slept there. This was not the Canada of anybody's dreams. No. But our place, well, it had 2 bedrooms. It had a living room.
You were together.
It had a kitchen with a big wood stove. It had no indoor plumbing, indoor water, but that's all. But my father quickly covered the house with decent tar paper, so it was closed in the front porch and fixed the back porch. He knew how to. You can't afford a fridge. I mean, people on our street either had nothing or they had an ice box. But the iceman would come and you had to pay for the ice. My father knew how to make a cold storage, because everybody in Poland did. Everybody had a cold. Actually, if you had any brains, you had a cold storage anyway, if you had the space. So he made a cold storage, and nothing froze in winter, and nothing was spoiled in summer. It was perfect. So everything was done. When spring came, how they bought the house is just another one of those miracles, because they actually persuaded the bank manager to give them a loan. Absolutely.
Even though at that time they weren't Canadian citizens?
We weren't citizens. We had no assets as collateral. My parents only had 3 little liabilities. So, but in those days, local bank managers had quite a bit of discretionary power. And I think he could do it on the basis that he really believed these people would pay it back. And believe me, the house cost $1,000. So they paid it back. And we lived there for 4 years.
And at that time, you were the only Polish people in Pembroke?
In Pembroke, yes.
So
I
you
think
didn't have too many opportunities to mingle with...
not at all, no.
Interact with other Polish people?
No, not at all. There were some working in the forests, the younger men, who came to Canada on that basis. But no, in Pembroke itself, there were some people of Polish heritage, but no longer speaking Polish.
But at home,
yes,
you always spoke Polish.
At Polish, we spoke home.
There was no doubt about it, who you are, and you knew that you were Polish, living in Canada.
Well, yes, especially since, well, what can I say? Because I'm only telling, I have to say that I was a very happy little refugee kid. My sisters, not so much, because they lost something. I didn't. I mean, I lost Tengeru, that's true.
But for them, it was 6 years of Tengeru when they were in...
When they were waiting to go back to Poland and rebuild Poland. And when they knew they were destined for something important. And in Pembroke, it's not a very sophisticated town. I mean, I remember, for example, once I was at a playground, and one of the boys rather roughly said, "Oh, you're a DP." I didn't know what a DP was, so I went home and I asked my mother, of course. And she said, "Displaced person," and that's why we were displaced by the Russians. She explained the story, and that's why we traveled so. So the next time I was at the playground, I went to the boy, and I said, "I'm a DP, and that means displaced person, and that's why I've been all over the world, and you haven't." And I was like that. My sisters, not so much, because being a teenager is difficult. Being an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, not very difficult. You know, I had no problems with them. And I started making up stories, and these kids had never been anywhere.
Right.
If I wanted to say I was riding an elephant to school, what did they know? They saw Tarzan movies on Saturday.
Yeah.
And so it kind of...
So in a way, you were able to use your complicated personal family story as an advantage.
Yeah. I did, and I had all
and
these...
you took it after your mother, because you mentioned a while ago that in every context, in every situation, she was trying to...
Always, yes. So I think I got that, and you know, in the girls of the convent school came from the more affluent families, and in those days, if you had a birthday party, all the kids were invited, although the classes were small at the convent. So I would go to their houses, and they lived in the better part of town, in a brick house, or at best a clapboard, but certainly not where I lived. And I lived on the wrong side of tracks. I was always invited. And when my birthday came, do you know that it never entered my head that there was anything wrong with my place? I mean, it didn't occur to me to be embarrassed or to say I live. It just...
But you had your birthday party at home.
I invited my friends. Everybody came. My poor mother managed to do some kind of version of a Canadian birthday party, and nobody was told they couldn't go to that. It never occurred to me. I was so convinced. Well, I don't know. Sometimes I think it's because I thought I had a perfect mother, I had a perfect life. Maybe that was it. But that was, my sisters had a hard time. I remember many years, not that many years ago, in fact, I'm talking to Wanda, and I've read a lot of immigrant literature, not just Polish literature, immigrant, Jewish, and all kinds. Very often there's a theme of wishing you were like everybody else, something like that. Or admiring or aspiring to be as Anglo as possible, especially in Anglo.
Yeah.
Quebec was a very different scene. But so I asked Wanda, I said, when we came to Canada, did you ever wish you were like everybody else and that our family was like? She said, good God, no, I wish they were like us. So, but she actually left Pembroke before she finished high school. She couldn't stand it anymore. Unknown to anybody, she was reading the classified ads in the Ottawa newspaper, which she probably got at the library, because we didn't subscribe. And she found an ad for, the euphemism is a mother's helper.
Okay. The au pair type of...
An au pair, exactly. Student to live with a rather affluent family in Sandy Hill, look after the children. Good student, preferred help with homework needed. Wanda was a 95% student, I mean, nothing. So without telling anyone, she made an excuse to go to Ottawa for something, came to Ottawa on a bus, got an interview, was offered the job, went home and informed the family she was moving to Ottawa.
How old was she? 16?
She was in grade 12.
Okay. What?
She couldn't stand Pembroke another day. That was, she had it. She thought, well, she thought many things.
What about you? You said your family stayed in Pembroke for 4 years, and then you moved.
And then we moved to Ottawa.
Okay.
And my oldest sister, in the meantime, went to study nursing, because nursing was free in those days, and she went to the Ottawa Civic Hospital and provided room and board. And then when my father's contract expired and he was actually being paid a decent wage, because the contract was extremely exploitative, but they didn't realize that when they were in England. Even though the letter of reference came from a bishop, but there you go. So he got a better, he changed companies and started to work for McRae Lumber, which was, you know, paid a decent salary. And then they could think about selling this place, which they had improved after all, and they sold it and moved to Ottawa because they just, well, it meant longer drives for my father.
Because he was still in.
But that's his profession. He had no choice but do that. But by that time he had a good car, and and he could arrange things, and they had to work the whole time because.
You mean work at home?
Work outside of the home. Because she worked plenty at home with a wood stove and all that stuff. But in Pembroke, well, she worked in a laundry for a while. That made her sick, actually. Looking after children. So she did that, and I would go with her. After a while, I started babysitting. My sisters were babysitting. My sisters also started playing the organ at the smaller Catholic church in Pembroke. They took turns, so they didn't have to get up early every day. They took turns, but it provided extra money. So everybody was doing something, and I could, even though by the time I was 10, I could look after little kids after school, not do anything. And eventually I was 12, almost 13 when we moved, so I was doing a lot of babysitting, and so was my mother. But I don't think she did other kinds of work in Pembroke. There's nothing to do in Pembroke. We came to Ottawa, had to find a place. She found a room, just to look. First she found a rooming house on Elgin Street, because it was just up the street from the convent, because she put me into what was then called the Gloucester Street Convent. And went there. And while I was at school, she was looking for work. There was a family on Lyon Street that there was an old couple. They were in their 80s, I suppose, around 80. They lived upstairs. They needed a housekeeper. So my mother went to see them, and they interviewed her. Yes, she could cook and she could look after everything. And they showed her the room that they had for her, which was a very nice room, very big, but it was, near the kitchen. And my mother said, "Oh yes, that will be fine. My daughter can sleep with me. Then when my husband comes to visit, she'll sleep in the living room."
And those people were like,
But this was after the whole interview, and they had got to like her. And they said, well...
They had to accommodate her.
Either that or say no.
Yeah.
So they said, well, we'll try it. So then Mother came home and told me, well, we're moving, dear. We went to Lyon Street. So we got there. And sure enough, she was cooking, and we all ate together. Mr. and Mrs. Cassidy thought this was absolutely grand. They had somebody to have dinner with every day. And then they also had a piano, and they found out that I studied piano. So then I had a job. I had to play a little Chopin for them every night before dinner. And there was. So that was our 1 year in Ottawa. And I'm sure it was awful for my mother. But you see, this is what she did. I tell all these happy stories, and the whole time my mother, it couldn't have been her first choice.
No.
But she imbued this in me. I don't know how she did it, but as you can tell, I can't get rid of it. It's like, she kept telling me there's a rainbow everywhere. What can I do?
I understand that attitude, I think. Life is not perfect. Sometimes there is a number that's not like the best, but you take it, you try to profit from that, you try to improve, and then you move on.
Yeah. And
now, you did say a 1 year in Ottawa, or the first
No,
year
this was this one year with the Cassidys. And after that, we moved again, because really this was not ideal. They rented a place on Sunnyside Avenue in Ottawa South, near Brighton Beach. That was fun. And then we actually had a real home of our own with everything, and not extra people and stuff. But of course, Mother was working, and she found some interesting. Work. One thing she found. Oh, maybe this was not yet, but we'll come to that. So on Sunnyside, I went to this And we lived there maybe for another, maybe lived on Sunnyside for a year and a half or so. Like I said,
And
a
by
lot
that
of
time,
moves.
Of course, your mother's English
Kept improving and improving, yes.
And of course, you and your sister, while in the street, you would pass by as Canadians.
Yeah.
You lost all your Polish, Central European accents.
I think with my sisters, people still sometimes think it's maybe a second language, but not because there are any errors. There's just something that's not quite, because they were that much older than I. With me, you know, it just went. But yes, the Polishness was still there. Of course, I had a constant reminder because every year at school, the nuns would make me stand up and tell the class my story.
Because you were unique. There was nobody else
in that school, yes, in that school, that's true. By going to that kind of school, I was. Although at the convent in Ottawa, there was a girl who was from Hungary, also immigrants. They never asked her to tell her story, but I was constantly telling stories. And so they would ask, and, you know, they liked the fact, of course, that we were, I don't know, such brave Polish people, and, you know, all that stuff. So every year I had to, and...
But at that time, was there any Polish community, Polish Canadian community in Ottawa? Did you meet anybody else?
There was very much a Polish community in Ottawa, but not in my... I met a few people with Mother, but that came a little bit later, but okay, a little bit later, doesn't matter, details don't matter, because eventually she did actually start translating, and she taught Russian for a while.
Because of course
she spoke perfect, flawless Russian. You know, poetry and literature was her big thing. She knew the Polish community enough. For example, that painting over there, that's Montrealski, the sun.
Yes, the sun.
The sun. She went to that, to a vernissage for him.
But
he was
in Montreal, probably.
No, it was here. This was when he was dying. He was dying of cancer, and some Polish people in Ottawa had this to raise money for him, and my mother bought that painting. So she obviously had contacts with, but at this point we were not really into Polishness, into the Polish community, or frankly the Polish church. I mean, we went our own way, and so we didn't do much of that. But for some reason, I didn't. We never actually lost it. We were aware of it. With me, what happened was my intense curiosity about how and why all this happened. Because it's one thing to know the family story, but I had to know about how and why. The geopolitics just had to fill in. It all started with, you know, as a teenager, finding out, reading what Churchill wrote in his last memoir. It was so dismissive and so distasteful. These were his allies, and the way he wrote about them, and then Roosevelt, and because it was in that, you know, I only went to his last volume of. That's the book I bought for my parents for Christmas. It was such a lovely title, Triumph and Tragedy. And I thought, instead I look at it in the Polish sections. And there was Roosevelt's memorandum to Stalin saying, but we must not discuss Yalta until after our elections, because I don't want to lose the Polish-American vote. And I thought, oh, you bastard, you know, what is this? So this, but then you know, I did talk to my parents, because I was very upset. And they explained it to me, but they chose not to. You're not going to nurse disagreements or a resentment, so I didn't. But it never left me.
But at a certain point in time, and that's one of my questions, when you somehow became focused, some people might say obsessed, with the Polish history, with the telling of that history to the outside world, researching it, and just being known here in Canada. Was there like a turning point in your life,
Yeah.
or a particular encounter with anyone who sort of pushed you towards studying history and then focusing on all those tragic and at the same time wonderful things like Żegota, for example, or the bravery of the Polish soldiers, etc., etc.?
Well, yes, of course, there was a turning point. Well, it never left me. My mother had given me Oskar Halecki's books when I was young. She knew I was interested in history. So there was that. General Anders's book. But then in 1980, I think it was 80, my son started McGill. Mm-hmm. And I thought I'd go back too, and I went to Concordia. And a professor, in a discussion of the Second World War in Europe, a professor told me, well, he was giving a rather strange history to begin with. I mean, I wasn't, but until I raised the point, when he talked about the Russians, it was as though they'd come to liberate Poland. And I said, the Russians deported a great many Poles to their camps. And the professor said, the Russians didn't deport anybody. And it was with this, you poor silly child, you know. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it ruined my life. It really ruined. And you used the word obsessed, and I think it is. Because then you actually maybe make it sound too good, because you said, you know, inform or teaching or telling the world. Not really. I had to satisfy my own curiosity. I mean, I called it before. I said there was a betrayal, and I felt that a great injustice had been done. But in those intervening years, I didn't realize that this injustice had actually been compounded over the many years. Mm-hmm. I didn't realize that year after year, students in probably every university in the continent, in the Anglosphere, were being taught this nonsense about Russia. And that Polish history was not just denied, but completely altered. And it infuriated me. It absolutely infuriated me. So the reason I think the word obsessed was right is that more than anything, I had to find out what happened for myself. I was like a crazy detective or something. I had to find the motive for this, you know, in order to find the culprit. The fact that I sort of informed some people.
Succeeded in spreading
well,
the world.
I think it's nice of you to say succeed, because I don't feel successful. I think all my efforts had such limited results that I don't really take great satisfaction in it, other than the fact that I satisfied a lot of what I was looking for something, and I had to find it, and but you know, I didn't just, and it wasn't through, of course, only the Polish story, because if you do that, you won't find out anything, or you'll find out very little. History interested me anyway.
But that's not your first choice, first topic of your studies.
History was, yeah.
Oh.
But I didn't plan on focusing so much on Poland. Mm-hmm. Because I didn't realize the depth of this injustice, and it bothered me so. A lot of things. For example, this denial of things. So when I got heard this professor say this, I thought, all right, I have to write a term paper. It's going to be on the deportation. So I went to the library at Concordia, nothing. Absolutely not a word, no book, nothing. I went to the McGill Library. I came across the same void. But the librarian there did say, oh, you should go to Stanford. Well, I couldn't go to Stanford because I was too busy with, across the continent. Well, I had 2 kids at school here anyway. It was out of the question. I couldn't afford it. I couldn't do anything. So I just had to to be honest, Concordia itself at the time, there was nobody who could guide me. I mean, it was like an unknown topic. And it stayed that way for a long time. Like, where the devil is Eastern Europe? And who cares? So I was coming across that. And of course that bothered me because I knew where Eastern Europe was and I did care. So that response bothered me. And then some of the readings that I was doing and some of the opinions expressed by the professors, other than this fool, but others. I mean, they knew nothing about Poland, but my goodness, they had opinions. And so when I said, well, who's going to guide me for my master's? Well, there wasn't anyone. Finally, one young professor of German studies said he would. And this was still in the 80s. And he said, well, he said, sort of falling on me, because nobody knew. And he said, but look what I found when I discovered that I'd have to do something with you. Look what I found. And it was God's Playground, because it was a fairly new book at the time. And he said, look at this. He said, look at the title. Well, now I have it there, of course, because I immediately went out and bought it. But I had an interesting conversation with him. But God's Playground wasn't enough. So anyway, in the end, I mean, I had to do so much. Well, of course, I discovered that there was such a thing as a Polish library at McGill. So I went there. I also discovered I had to suddenly start reading Polish. And I had exactly grade 1 in Polish education. 1 year in Tengeru in Polish. But, you know, it's a beastly language to learn to speak. But once you know the alphabet, it is so totally phonetic that I could read it. Slowly, very slowly. Of course, I needed dictionaries and so on.
Well, but you always have some command of Polish.
But I had never read Polish books.
And I presume that your vocabulary was like home-related or family-related, not like sophisticated history books.
Well, no, the family conversation was pretty broad-ranged.
Well, yeah, of course.
But not, no, I didn't have that hard time. To this day, well, still, of course, now it's improved. No, I didn't have I had a hard time, say, with memoirs, a personal memoir, because actually it was the family, the sort of informal Polish that I didn't have a command of. The formal Polish in a textbook, a lot of these words have Latin roots, have, revolution is a revolucja and so on. And so those things worked. Personal, like to this day, I don't really do small talk in Polish. I don't know how. I don't know how to ask you, how's your wife? How's your wife? I don't know these little things. These pleasantries are not my big...
And when was your first trip to Poland? When did you travel for the first time and for what purpose?
In 1988.
So that was still Poland on the wrong side.
It was still Poland.
But you didn't have any family there.
Oh, I have a huge extended family. I didn't know them at all. And of course, I had been to Europe, of course. Oh. I even had my toes in the Baltic one time, that cold sea, but in Denmark. And I vaguely remember thinking, oh my goodness, Poland's just over there. And then we kept on driving south through Germany to Switzerland and so on. But no, I hadn't gone to Poland. So in '88, of course, the time had come to go, partly because my second husband absolutely loved everything Polish. He wasn't Polish, but Poland was just Poland, and Poles, everything was wonderful. So he was, let's go. And
so like a private vacation.
A vacation.
With your Canadian passport.
Yes, but he knew, of course, that I had been inflamed by my studies and my frustrations. So I asked my mother, I said, can you give me one of your address books or something? Give me a couple of names. What should we do? And we weren't going for a long holiday. But she did write to one of her nephews who was living in Białystok now, and let him know that I was coming. And then the strangest thing happened. They met us at the Warsaw airport. Canadians don't do this. This is Polish hospitality. I mean, they drove from Białystok to meet people they didn't know.
They came all the way from
They came all the way
to
and
meet that distant cousin
that I'd never met. And they drove all the way from Białystok and picked us up at the airport and drove back to Białystok. And Jerzy and Julia were explaining what we were seeing, and I was looking around, and at times I was thinking, there were parts of Poland that I thought, you'd think the war only ended yesterday. I mean, everywhere else in Europe, it was reconstruction. But of course, by this time, I also knew that the reparations Germany paid had gone to Russia, which Russia, with its generosity, would then redistribute as it saw fit. So it didn't entirely surprise. I mean, I should have known, but I didn't expect it to look the way it looked. But it was interesting. So we got there. And of course, again, that hospitality. And my cousins were as if we had never lived in different continents. They all had houses full of books. They all had gardens. They all loved gardening. They loved nature. And I thought, this is so strange. One of my cousins, and this is on my mother's side, one of my cousins had the same job my father had before. He was nadleśniczy. And I said to him, can you show me that forest, the primeval? He said, no, that's for scientists. I said, nepotism won't work? No, it's for scientists. I don't take anybody in there. It's only for, okay. But he showed me bison and he showed me tarpon horses, and he was wonderful. And my mother's oldest sister was still alive. And Maya was 96 then, I think. And when she was...
So you met her?
So I met her the year before she died.
You were her niece, of course.
I was her niece, and of course she had never met me. And when they took me to her room, she had apparently was still up the Christmas before.
And that was a house where your...
No, the house was completely, I don't know. It was Władek's house.
Okay.
It had nothing to do with my parents lost everything, actually. My parents lost everything. But it was Władek's house, and Maya, my grandmother, lived with them. 96, very frail. She had still been up helping with the cooking at Christmas, but this was summer. And they took me to her room. She looked at me and she thought I was my mother. So
there was so much resemblance.
There was so much resemblance, and she just thought, Nunya. Anyway, so that was, but she went back to sleep. She kind of, the last 6 months of her life, she was mostly sleeping. But I enjoyed everybody's company so much. Then the cousin in Białystok, he was a veterinarian, because that's the studies he had to take. But he didn't mind. He told me how terribly important it was after the war. Because the animals suffered too.
Of course.
And You know, if you're telling starving people, hungry people, impoverished people that you have to slaughter some animals, they don't take it well.
No. No, because they know that they are dependent on
Yes,
animals,
of course.
be it milk,
Of course,
or butter,
everything.
Everything.
So
Eggs.
to understand that because of the health of everything, they have to be. And so he told me, it was a fascinating history, that what he had to do once he finished his veterinarian studies. And then the other brother, there were 4 brothers in the family. They were all nephews of my mother's,
They were all
but they were much older than I. Because
so in a way, you're saying that during that trip, you were able to reconnect with Poland, with that Poland that you've never lived, and somehow you're...
I identified it immediately. I said, of course, everything I heard. You know, and the last brother was in fisheries. You know, I mean, it just... well, there was one that he was living in Gdańsk, but he did come down to meet. He was a teacher. But this is just it. There was all books and art science and that kind of stuff. So that was that family. But it was a short holiday, so we couldn't stay too long, but we had to go to each place, of course. And they showed me where my mother and father met. Because in Białowieża, there is still an office for the Białowieża Forest.
Of course.
And they took me there, and Jurek said, upstairs, see that window? That was where your mother's office was. And she was working there as a secretary. And your father was coming there regularly with reports and whatever it had to be. And so they met.
So this is where it all started.
And that's where it all started. So he met.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So he met this girl that was. There she was. And so then from there, we went off to Warsaw, and nobody was warned in advance about us. However, I had a phone number of a Warsaw cousin. So I called up, and somebody answered the phone, and I said, tu mówi Irena Tomaszewska, czy pani wie, kto ja jestem?
Do you know who I am?
And I heard, oh, and there was shouting, it's Irena Tomaszewska. And I heard all this commotion in the family, and where are you? And we said, we're at the train station in Warsaw. We just got here. So they came to pick us up. They lived in Żoliborz. And we said, well, you know, we haven't booked in a hotel. Well, you're not staying in a hotel.
No,
I mean, you know, everything was Polish style, you know, always, always. And that great joke about Poland in those days, that the stores were empty, the tables were always laden with food, because they all had their own farmers, and it was strawberry season. And I remember tasting these cherries that we bought on a roadside from a woman walking on the roadside. And the driver that we hired wanted to ask for directions. And the woman saw that we were tourists. She held this bag and she said, $1. So we gave her $1. And there were these cherries. And my husband tasted one. He said, so this is what cherries are supposed to taste like. And it's true.
So they're different cherries than the ones that he...
It's more than that. It's more than that.
So far.
You know, Polanski, the director, was one. Yeah, the director was once interviewed, and he was talking about his arrival in Los Angeles, and all his new friends were saying, oh, but we have to take you to our market. And he said they took him to the Los Angeles market. And he said he'd never seen anything like it. He'd never seen fruit so big, colors by Technicolor. And he said, no, they had no taste. There's truth in that. There's a lot of truth in that. There's something.
And those cherries,
Oh, those And these,
Oh, no,
yeah, so
they taste different.
they tasted different, and really, and they did. And we're getting better stuff now here because we're getting a lot of local stuff. I mean, people are learning that it doesn't all have to come from agribusiness, you know. So anyway, so that was our. But the Warsaw family was just the same. They were, you know, putting us up and showing us stuff, and Eric, and of course, and Eric driving by. And I remember this: we were driving along. You will know what street. I get very mixed up, but you'll know exactly when I tell you. We're driving along, and he's going quite slowly, and I'm looking out the window, and I said, "Eric," I stopped. What's the matter? I said, "Is that a statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, well, "What the hell is it doing here?" Well, this was '88.
Yes.
But you know, for all that I knew, thought I knew, the last thing I expected, I thought maybe Lenin, bloody Lenin, but Dzerzhinsky anyway, so
2 years later it was gone.
2 years later it was gone. So that was partly it. Then, and then again, this family, my cousin Marisha was a librarian, a great gardener, but she had a działka because this is Warsaw. So, and then introduced to Zita. Zita lived in Mazowiecki, on the way to something I can't remember, a smaller town west of Warsaw, but not far.
Grodzisk.
No, something Mazowiecki.
Okay, Grodzisk, Mazowiecki, just, anyway.
It doesn't matter. I mean, I have it written down somewhere, I just don't remember now. And she was a dentist. Her 2 daughters were doctors. And they married doctors, and a house full of books, and it was all. And then Zita showed me a house she was building, that she had been building for maybe 12, 15 years, slowly, because it was modeled, slightly smaller version of the dvorek or whatever dvor that she was raised in, you know, that she remembered from our. This is my father's side of the family in what's Belarus now, and you know, it's 12, 15 years later, it still wasn't finished. A few years later, it was right after '89. She was a dentist, so anyway, she quickly finished it up, but she fashioned it so faithfully to the dvorek that she remembered.
I can see that you were able to connect with them on this sort of mental, intellectual, spiritual level.
Yeah.
That in a way you found yourself in an environment
Totally familiar.
Exactly.
So all these books weren't a waste of time. You know, when I met my family, the context was there. I already knew all this stuff. I had seen, you know, the fairly modest living of my mother's family. And, well, I never did get to Belarus, so I never, and I probably wouldn't have found it. You know, like you, I would have found ruins probably, but it was there. But so anyway, again, the family, it was just, there was a connection. And 2 years later, I did go back to Poland, this time for a longer trip and by myself, and stayed there for 6 weeks and got to know everybody more and picked up more information. And it was all, you know, terribly, you know, so I picked up some incredibly interesting, I still didn't meet everybody, and I never have. I've never met everybody. But that was sort of the culmination of it all. And then, of course, but this was still only 1991, and I think it was in 1991, I think, is when I published my first article on Poland. I had published in the Globe and Mail and the Gazette before that.
And And since then you have published...
Not that much. I can't exaggerate. It was modest, but I did because it wasn't easy. There's not that much interest in Polish stuff. There wasn't. But my first one was in the Toronto Star, and it was on Katyn because Yeltsin had just delivered the documents, and I thought, you know, newspapers, if you can make it topical or something, make a connection. So it was published in the Toronto Star in a weekend edition, so it was a full page. But I was still not really part of any Polish community anywhere.
So at that time you didn't have any name recognition?
Oh, I didn't know. Not even, I didn't, well, I didn't even have Polish friends. I went to the library now and then, the Polish library, but I had no Polish social life except my husband's friends, but that was mostly party stuff. We just did party.
Throughout all that time you lived here in Ottawa?
No, I was living in Montreal.
Oh, so you lived...
I was living in Westmount then. So the funny part is when this article in the Star appeared, the phone rang all day long. Polonia, now I will use that word, well, Toronto Star was more popular with Polonia than Globe and Mail anyway. Everybody started calling one another, like, who is she? Do you know her? Who is she? Is she Polish? She has a Polish name, but she can't be Polish. This is how it went. So the phone rang, and it rang, and it rang. My husband thought it was very funny. He started answering the phone, Irene Tomaszewski's office, and thought it was hilarious. Everybody was calling, who are you? Who are you? And this was and every one of them said, ask me, are you Polish? The name wasn't enough. Of course, it's Irene Tomaszewski, which could be misleading, but there was no use going back. Now, if I'm speaking Polish, I can't say Irena Tomaszewski. It's impossible.
No.
It's either Irene Tomaszewski or Irena Tomaszewska. Otherwise, it hurts your ears, doesn't it? And so that's, and then I brought a copy of that article to the consulate in Montreal. And I just went to the wicket where it was on Pine Avenue then, to the wicket where people would go, and I'd say, would you please give this to the Consul General? So they did. And
you waited?
And no, I just gave it to them, and they said they'll deliver it to the,
and you just...
And I went home. And then a day later, the phone rang, and Małgosia invited me for coffee. So I went there for coffee, and 3 hours later, we were still drinking coffee and talking and talking. And then I started meeting people and
writing more.
And I started writing more but meeting, and I loved meeting the wartime generation. That's, to me, I did once want to write a book titled The Generation of 44, because I think there's no generation like it, no matter what the Americans say. They don't really know. The generation of 44 is the Polish generation of 44. I've never loved any people so much as I did them. I wrote about them whenever I had a chance. They had an exhibit.
Because in the early 90s, the big figures were already gone.
Yes.
General Sosnkos.
Oh yes, yes, yeah.
He passed away.
Yeah.
The Babinski Senior, that's a long time ago.
Yes.
But there were many other people.
But there were a lot of the younger ones. Of course, the ones actually who did the fighting. Well, later on I met Admiral Tomiński, but that was a couple of years later. But what was interesting to me was when I started meeting them, was first of all my affection for them all. I mean, they were so bloody charming. I mean, every one of them. They were so charming, so polite, and so interested by the fact that I was interested in them. And then I realized that on top of the betrayal and the injustice, there was the amnesia, and there was the lack of interest in them. That they had,
In a way, the longer they lived, the more they closed in their sort of circles, because for the present generation,
The
Very
younger,
little interest.
the younger
in-
generation was not
in
interested.
the majority of their children became Canadian citizens and blended in. Many of them married to Canadian or other nationalities.
Yes.
So in a way, the Polish part of their personal history was of no interest.
Well, I wouldn't say that, because as I started meeting them, more of them carried on traditions. More of them carried on, for example, with religious patterns. More of them had vigilia that was traditional. I only like traditions if I can adapt them, for my own purposes, wherever I am. But most of them did not have much interest in their parents' stories.
No.
Or in the story. A lot of them, of course, were heavily influenced by our popular media, which was no longer friendly to Poland.
No.
Or flattering to Poland, and by, well, the education. If they went to university, when I was at Concordia, my son was at McGill. I mean, the places were wall-to-wall Marxists, and they taught what they taught. And I remember once Pierre coming home and talking about, because he was studying political science, and he was saying something. I said, well, Pierre, for heaven's sakes, you know your grandmother. Why don't you tell this professor what nonsense he's talking about? And but then I realized what a problem he had, because it takes guts to challenge a professor, because you can't challenge somebody in a classroom by saying, well, my grandmother told me. You need more than that. But we didn't have that anywhere. Because we couldn't quote newspapers, we couldn't quote textbooks. They were absent, they were missing in action.
Yeah, there was no access.
No,
Right?
no. So if somebody with the effort I had made couldn't find it, so they couldn't. And there's an interesting book coming out pretty soon, in February, I think. I was asked if I would write a blurb for it when it comes out, so I did. And it's written by the wife of somebody Polish, a lawyer, who had known the family. The parents were both, one fascinating thing. The mother, very, very uniquely Polish. The mother had been arrested and sent to Germany to work, and the father had been sent to the Gulag. This is a uniquely Polish story. Maybe not later on. But in the sense of September 39, no other country ever was attacked by both armies that way. And even Poles don't know that. So anyway, what happened to this woman is, who wrote the book, not being Polish, when she retired, she was a lawyer, she retired, it suddenly occurred to her that the little bit she knew about her in-laws, they had never talked. Her husband, who was their son, didn't give a damn. So she did. So she started to do a little research. What did I think of the book? Well, I shouldn't. No, this part I shouldn't. That would be rude. The book's not going to be published sometime soon. And anyway, overall, I think it's it could be a conversation starter, I think. But so this is it. So I started to realize what was wrong, and then when that first documentary was made for CBC in '94, that's not the one that they planned. Brian McKenna, who lived in my neighborhood, came over to my place to have a chat, because there was going to be a 5-minute segment on Poland in his new documentary.
1 hour.
Yeah. So would I do the research for this 5 minutes? Freelancer, I said, of course. What? So, but we had a long conversation, and I had mentioned things, and I said, well, wait a minute, and I had some copies of articles that I had Xeroxed, I had some books, I had General Anders's book, and Brian is listening to me. He just thought it would be a quick, do you want this job? 5 minutes, research for, and he said, Well, that, you know, he said, it's interesting, but you know, you're not exactly I mean, you're Polish. And I said, and you're Irish, Brian. So what do we decide from that? I'm Polish, so I'm telling lies. And you're Irish, you must be drunk all the time. Well, no, that's not really how it works. Really, we don't live up to stereotypes. So he took it home, and my stuff home, and I didn't hear from him for 2 weeks. I was sure I would not get the job. Then he came back, and he said, oh my God, that betrayal. Mm-hmm. And that was the first time. And I must say, he put his whole heart, he only had an hour. That's the length he had to stick to. But I got it, you know, he really put his heart into it. He realized there was a story, and you know, Pauls have a way of making titles, The Untold Story. No, it's been told, it's just that nobody was listening. People refused to listen. And he was not refusing to listen at this point. And he was very impressed, especially by General Anderson's book. And then the people, I mean, there's so many other great stories that could have been included in the film had it gone longer. There's a woman in Toronto, she may still be alive. And I mean, quite likely, she wasn't very old. She was one of the youngest of the uprising people. Mm-hmm. She had a little notebook from that during the uprising, in between in Warsaw, mm-hmm. in between bombs and in between running and being a courier and being a nurse and having one of your friends die in your arms, when there was a lull, it was her French workbook. So she had French irregular verbs, and then a poem about the latest friend who was killed, and then more French irregular verbs. That book is a treasure. I hope you can get the consul in Toronto to find her. I'll see if I can find her name. That book should be immortalized. I've never seen anything so beautiful.
Right, practicing irregular French verbs amidst...
In the middle of the Warsaw Uprising, while you're looking after your wounded mm-hmm. friends who are not much older than you are. I mean, what a beautiful, beautiful thing she was. I just adored her, you know, and but I adored so many of them. In Montreal, there was Leszek and Krystyna Misala. Mm-hmm. I mean, and Krystyna was, I wrote on, there was one anniversary of the uprising. I decided to pitch a story to the Gazette about the anniversary. And I was going to write about the scouts, mm-hmm. the Szare-Szeregi. Mm-hmm. And I knew that Krystyna had a beautiful photograph of herself as a young scout in her Szare-Szeregi. And her hair, I mean, she's just such a beautiful thing. And so I called them up and I said, Krystyna, would you let me have that picture? Mm-hmm. Reluctantly, but she said yes. So I sent that to the Montreal Gazette. So they featured a large article. I have these things with my story.
And Krystyna's photo.
And she was at McGill, you know, she was a scientist. Mm-hmm. Can't remember what her field was. And she had never told anybody. Her friends were all going to her.
Is that you, resistance?
That's you, Krystyna, that's you. You never told us, you know. Never told anybody. And Leszek was such a wonderful guy, you know. He finished, you know, he was an engineer because mm-hmm. after the war, you had to be an engineer. Polish guys all went into engineering. But what he really would have liked to study is what he did when he retired. He went back to university and did fine arts. He studied art history. Because he wanted to do his dissertation on Polish art, and he did. I mean, there were so many of them, and I just met one after another and loved every one of them. And they were all interesting people. And my venture into Żegota, well, actually that was different, because I came across Żegota before this. But to be honest, I knew I didn't have a chance of publishing it if I wrote it, because really, you know, it was so far from everything that was being written. Um, but then with Tecia Werbowski, and Tecia also knew all these people, and she liked them all. She, we both loved this generation.
Tecia is one of the interviewees of our program.
Yes.
We have a recording with her.
Yeah, she just, took an interest in all this, and we were both on the board of the Polish Jewish Heritage Foundation. And then there started to be some tensions in that board at the time, but I'm not going to go there. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. But with the people that I met, and some of the people at the library who are no longer with us, Brzeski, what a fascinating man he was. But anyway, I could go on, but I won't now. But so there was all that. And then I started a student group because the universities had their Polish Students Association up. But I said, okay, we'll have a PSA-M of Montreal. Doesn't matter what university, what CJEP, you can join. And Małgosia Wituska was the Consul General at the time on Pine Avenue. And she said, Irenka, use my gabinet for your meetings, just go ahead. So, Polish hospitality, really. So we did. We would meet there. Eventually, this group got big, but it doesn't matter. They sat on the floor. Nobody cared. Nobody cared where they sat. We had this. We had Mariela Nitasławska. I'm sure you know her, of course. She had done a film of Polanski when he had, maybe you've seen it.
I haven't seen the film. I know Mirella, of course.
Then you must ask Mariela for it. I once had it. I don't know if I still do. She called it Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. It was Polanski going back to the film school after his, was it after Chinatown or Rosemary's Baby? But anyway, he was a big name. He was a big, big name. But he goes back to the film school, and he's sitting in a chair like this, and the students are all around, some on the floor, some standing, all around. He's a star. He's a big name. And they're arguing, and he loves it. He's not expecting to have star treatment, American style. He's a Poe, for heaven's sake. He enjoyed
And all this is taking place in Łódź, in his...
Yes. And Mariela was there that year, so she filmed it. And we showed it to the students in Małgosia's cabinet, and Mariela was there for that. And I mean, it was wonderful. Another time we had a meeting, and this was wonderful. I got, actually, Małgosia Wituska's husband, Andrzej Ziemilski.
The journalist, yes.
So he was Jewish originally, but he was in the AK, and so he came to talk about his experiences in the AK. At the same time, I invited Jan Romanowski, who had been the aide-de-camp to Anders. So here we had the two streams, and the students were sitting on the floor. They were riveted, absolutely riveted. They, but in those days, nobody was using cameras. Well, some people were, but not me. No. And nobody offered. This was always a one-person production. But what a loss. I mean, it was...
That's one of the purposes of the project.
Yeah, but it's late. I mean, I'm nobody compared to the people I'm describing. But can you imagine and since then I've told so many people, if you really want to talk about Paul, I mean, don't forget that Russian-German, this is what makes our story unique. I proposed it several times. I didn't have, not being an academic, I had no access to grants and so on, but I've talked to so many people. We could do a book of just families who were touched by both occupations. People who had family. Actually, that young woman who had the beautiful uprising notebook with the French verbs and so on, she was, at the end of the war, she was taken to Oberlangen. When Oberlangen was liberated, it was by Polish soldiers, as you know. I mean, talk about an exciting story. When I kind of did a good job with that. But this young woman's, her brother had come to visit her. He had, while she was at Oberlin, he had gone through the Russian route. You know, what a story. What a story. And you know, when it comes to films, I had lunch with a young man in Warsaw not long ago. Well, not long ago, 4 years ago. And he was, you know, talking about the Cold War, and he said, does a Polish film have to end with a double suicide? And then I thought about it, because I liked the film. But when he said that, I thought, no, they don't have to end in a double suicide. Because no matter where you are, there's always, you know, my mother's not the only one who had that spirit. It's everywhere. But we have a hard time linking it. I think there is, of course, a segment of the population that prefers tragedy and victim. Yes, I know. But these people exist everywhere. I mean, they like sad stories. But it's the way Admiral Tymiński met his wife after the war, the liberation of Oberlangen. I mean, how many people know there were 360 marriages out of that? You know, there's a movie, for heaven's sakes. I mean, I remember talking to Mira Swinarska. She said, my God, we didn't sleep for weeks. I mean, the dancing, the joy. And, you know, to just bring this out, and yet I've never seen a film on that. It's just as important as the tragic films. It really is. I think the schools are an important part of history. So when I talk about Tengeru, the reason I talk about it at all is that at a certain point, on top of my happy memories, something came to me that said, but how did that come to be? Why did those schools exist? Who set them up? And I've been trying to find the source, of course, is the Polish government in exile. It was actually as though they were building schools. I mean, Poland built how many? 18,000 schools in Poland, in post-war Poland, in the space of 18 years. So education was big. They had a psychiatrist who traveled around the various camps, Victor Shurinsky, who used to live here. They had that. This was a very enlightened community of people, but you'd never know it if you just...
Right. There are so many fascinating stories and so many...
And I'm going on too long, I apologize.
No. But I wanted, before we finish, I wanted to ask you two questions. Question one is more personal, the question two is a bit more general. You yourself identified yourself while talking about your conversation with this Canadian-Irish film director. You said, I'm a Pole. How do you identify yourself? You're a Canadian, you're a Pole, you're a Pole living in Canada. That's the first question. What about your children is the part of the second of this question.
Oh, I can tell you a little bit about them. They certainly know. How could they not? You know, yeah. Although unlike many, they don't. I mean, they never said, "Oh, there she goes again." You know, because maybe it's because it wasn't. And also, they adored their grandmother. But there's something else. You will know for sure. I'm not sure which poet. I think it's
Słowacki?
Yes. I'm a Pole because I like it. Is that his line?
Nie, to Tuwim.
Tuwim, okay.
It's Tuwim.
I'm a Pole because I like it. Well, I'm going to slightly revise that line. I'm a Pole because I find it fascinating. I couldn't stop. Once I started, I kept finding more and more interesting personalities. And to be honest, one of the things about Żegota, it was, yes, heroic, there's no question. I mean, but there were so many heroes. The trouble with wars is that they create heroes. I mean, it was the personalities. I met Bartoszewski more than once. I adored the man. I mean, talk about a sense of humor, a quick wit. Just lovely, and absolutely no apologies. You know, I remember going to Washington to the Holocaust Museum for a conference. They invited him, and well, because there was a big media uproar about a discotheque in Auschwitz. What nonsense, but anyway. And so they invited him. It had to be with a translation, of course, because he speaks German, not English, but you know, totally unapologetically, he said, of course there's a discotheque in Oświęcim. It's a big town, and our people like to dance just as much as yours do. Our young people, that's how you handle that. You don't get apologetic. You don't start explaining. If people can't understand that young people dance everywhere, you can't have a city without a disco. I mean, and he just addressed it that way. He never, because there's no, I think one thing about our North America, because we've been personally so far removed from such things, unless African Americans, I mean Native Americans, but we know, but if you're talking about the dominant society, an easy life by and large. So when they talk about tragedies, they like to get sanctimonious, sentimental, because it's performative, rather. It's not the real thing. But when it's the real thing, you know perfectly well that there are all these things, and so there's something like that. So I think, if anything, I wasn't thinking much about my identity. If asked, I'm Polish, but you know. But now I can honestly, you know, paraphrase to him and say, I'm Polish because it's fascinating. And I can't stop. I mean, I still come across books and I've got to buy them. I've got Hanka Anders's book about, you know, her father. She's the first daughter.
Yes.
Fascinating woman. And I knew her and I absolutely loved her. And I have a book she gave me over there. It's a book about her father, and she wrote, because the reason I know her is I knew a number of people who lived in Rawdon, where she lived. And one time I had said to somebody, when we lived in those huts in Africa, they're round, you know, you don't have a lot of, it's hard to decorate. But I remember two framed photographs. One was my father, the other one was General Anders. And for a long time, I wasn't really sure which one was which, and it didn't matter to me at the time. But then, eventually, I found out, of course, who was who, and I always thought of General Anders as our collective godfather. He rescued us all.
Like Moses, who
sort of, yeah.
took you out of...
And also, because I was at the archives, and I read Tadeusz Romer's, a lot of them, documents. I read the transcript of Anders's meetings with Stalin. That guy had, I mean, he's probably the only man in the world who ever argued with Stalin. And he did. I mean, they're the most fascinating transcripts I'd ever read. So that's how it was. So somebody told Hanka, and so she said, well, let's meet. So I was invited to Irene Bellert's place, Hanka Anders, and she gave me this book, and she wrote something in it about to our joint, I don't know, it's written there, but she wrote, and you know, so this is just, and her own story is so fascinating, so incredibly fascinating. And again, difficult, I mean, tough times. You know, there's spirit there, and she remembers all the good stuff. And that's sort of, I think, how it goes, at least with how, you know, I remember all the good stuff. My mother always remembered the
good stuff.
Not that she was, but she didn't erase the bad.
No.
It's just that.
But she didn't ponder on
but it's what got me through, you know, this kind of stuff. So there's that. So my identity in that sense, I know I'm not like Polonia, and they know I'm not like them too, because I'm always asked whether I'm Polish. They suspect something else, not Polish, and I'm also, when I go to Poland, I don't identify. I'm not like the Poles.
No. But it's, in a way, Poland is your homeland. Poland is your country of origin.
Oh, without sense, and also, it interests me more than any other. And And believe me, I love Italy. Who doesn't? And I like, and France is a close second. But
I have a problem choosing between France and Italy.
well, there's something about Italy that really gets me. But you know, so there are but there is something about Poland. I guess because my introduction was to the Commonwealth, and the way my parents talked about it. Because, you know, I mentioned my mother was not Roman Catholic. She was the Orthodox kind. And mind you, General Anders was a Protestant, and his first wife was his second wife was, that doesn't matter. But you know what I mean. These are, but this is life. This is life. So my father, who came from a very old Tomaszewski family with their old place in Belarus, and my mother, who Georgian, or speaking Russian at home and going to North. So they got married in the Orthodox Church. And I said, why? Why? Well, you know, you had to choose one or the other. And from what I heard, more often they choose the Polish. And she said, because I sang in the choir. No, my father's the one explaining. She said, because your mother sings in the choir. She's got a beautiful voice. What did I care? It was that simple. It was, you know, it was a time when religion was, I won't say the word unimportant because it's wrong. It wasn't an issue. It wasn't something you quarreled about. Religion was something that you felt, and that was all. But now it's an issue. But it wasn't. He said he could no more deprive my mother of her choir. And of course, have you ever heard the Orthodox choirs? Oh, my goodness, there's nothing so beautiful. So,
what about your children? They were all born here in Canada. Your husbands were not of the Polish origin. Do they speak any Polish?
Not at all. They know how to sing Stolat.
Okay, that's important.
But they learned that from my second husband.
Okay.
Because Alex loved, as I told you, all things Polish. And you couldn't have a birthday without Stolat. And you couldn't, there are a lot of things you couldn't have without Stolat.
And of course, they know that they know your story. They probably have met your parents.
Well, they knew my mother and absolutely adored her. They didn't meet my father. My father died in 1962.
Okay.
He was only 59 years old. But they know, when they were small, we used to get together. In those days, we did do Vigilia here in Ottawa, because both my sisters were here. And it was at Wanda's house. No, nobody married a Pole, so. But they did Vigilia anyway, because they felt like it, and everybody adapted. And those were the days when nobody said, "I can't eat this" and "I can't eat that." Everybody. That's when everybody had.
For you, is that an issue? That, I mean, some people might say, for example, "Oh, look at that, Irene Tomaszewska. She was Polish, but she is Polish, but her children, her grandchildren,
For me,
don't
no.
speak Polish." So in a way, she's responsible for that.
Of course, I'm responsible for it, but you know what?
So it doesn't bother you.
But it doesn't bother me at all. No, Pierre speaks French, English, and Spanish. We're here. We're not there. And Richard speaks 2 languages, and this is. Do they know something about it? I'll tell you an interesting story about Pierre. He's with the Mining Association of Canada. Before coming to Ottawa to take this job, he was with Mining Association of British Columbia. While he was there, BC, now I may have a few details wrong here, so Pierre, forgive me. But anyway,
let's focus on generalities.
But he's heard me say this, so it doesn't matter. But University of BC was setting up a Indigenous Languages program. And the Mining Association of British Columbia was making a huge donation, like maybe $200,000 to endow it, and you know, and other people. So, but this was a very big donation. So there was a dinner or something, and he was presenting the check. And when he was presenting it, he he said, and of course the indigenous leaders were there and so on. And when he was presenting, he said, I'm so happy to make this donation on the industry that I'm with, because it's about a language that was forbidden. And my mother, who is Polish, comes from a country that has been occupied by Germany and Russia, and has also had, at times, its language forbidden. I'm probably paraphrasing, but that's the gist of what he said. And my point is that I know people who speak flawless Polish and have a Wigilia exactly the way it should be, but would never say that in a public place. You know, there are many ways of transmitting these things. I don't feel any guilt that they don't speak Polish at all. It wasn't an objective of mine. In many ways, I think if I did belong to Polonia, I'd find it a bit of a straitjacket.
That brings me to one of the questions that I wanted to ask you. You yourself, sort of, I placed yourself a bit of outside of the Polish-Canadian community, Polonia, the traditional Polonia. But of course you've been watching the developments in the community for many decades. What do you think is or are the biggest challenges for Polish-Canadian community now?
I wouldn't dare propose, you know, first of all, suggest what challenges face communities that I don't belong to. The other thing is that I wouldn't dare suggest what they should do. The only thing I can do, because I've done something like this once before, or maybe more than once on a smaller scale, I could tell you what I wish there was. You know, you've heard of Poland in the Rockies, I think. It was a program in the Rocky Mountains, and Tony...
conference for young Polish Canadians?
For all across North America.
Okay.
We had a couple come from England and Germany and even South Africa. So this was Tony Mashinsky's dream. I'd like to have a program that I would have liked when I was young, said Tony. And Tony's now around 60, I don't know, something. And so what he did is he created something that he wished he'd had when he was a young man and didn't.
So it was like a week-long...
10 days, but speakers. We had Norman Davies, we had Robert Frost, we had speakers. I mean, Zanussi was there.
So program focusing on...
We called it Things Polish. Because we didn't want it to be too academic. We also hiked and we also swam in the sulfur springs and visited canyons, had campfires. But there are a lot of things that were great fun about it. But yes, but there were a fairly intensive class work in terms of listening to.
Strong education.
Yeah, so educational. No,
much more than that.
So how much they got out of it is hard to say. Couple of marriages, that's not bad. You know?
No.
It's not as good as Oberlangen, but not bad. And they had, and from what I've heard, and I've heard from many, one thing is they all started enjoying being Polish, which they didn't before. We started in 2004. To tell you in all honesty, at that time, most of the students arrived. Being Polish was not a source of great pride. They felt the sting of prejudice. By the time they left Poland and the Rockies, watch out. How much of the history they actually retained, I don't know, because I don't follow them. Had we had different funding and, you know, big money, we would have had in between, like some program here and there on a smaller scale and just do a big one every 2 years. But that couldn't be done. But this was done because of something Tony wished he had had. But as it turned out, it didn't seem to be what Polonia wanted, because we could not sustain funding.
Because
and
there was only one such event There was no continuation.
Well, there were four of them actually.
Oh, there were four of them.
Yes, 2004, 6, 8, 10. And then some students tried to do one on their own. It's too big a project for young people to put together. You have to have the knowledge too. You have to know the speakers.
You had some support from a strong organization.
Yeah. So it didn't quite work. I commend them for trying. But so for me now, like what I'm lacking, I would love some kind of a group that might exist, but just for the intellectual content. I want people who find Poland as fascinating as I do, because I'm not really looking for Polish patriotism. I love it about as much as I ever will, which means both criticism and fascination, but it's like that. So I don't need it for that. I don't need it for traditions, because I've lived in too many places and I know too many people and I love them all. I mean, and I discard anything that doesn't suit me anyway. So that I don't need. But to be able to discuss all these books with, sometimes I finish reading something, who can I call? This is so wonderful. I've just encountered this yet another personality, and it's missing. And I've talked about it to a few people, and it's hard to do. I think there may be something like this in Seattle.
Perhaps.
There's a group I know of. They got interested in Poland and the Rockies and were in touch with us. We never did actually meet, but because they were in touch, I get their newsletter, and they have the usual, which is fine, but they do have a regular, ongoing program with intellectual content, discussions, book readings, and I mean in English, because of course in Polish, but I mean in English.
In English or in Polish?
No, to me, if it's not in English, you're going to have the problem that, it's wonderful, you can have them in Polish, but you're not going to find that many young people in Canada who are going to. Reading in Polish can be an effort if you don't go to a Polish school. It's an effort. And also, my interest has been primarily in what's the story here? I happen to know, my reaction was to the standard North American image of Poland. That's what made me react. If I'd been reading only Polish, would I know? And could you reply to that only in Polish?
No.
I find when Poles do try to reply to something, it's a very clumsy response. It's meant well, and I'm not going to say it's stupid, because it's not that. It's just that you have to, it's the idiom, it's knowing the cultural references that are familiar here. So in other words, while I can't integrate, while that wouldn't integrate linguistically, but it would integrate Polish history. And I think that's been a tragedy. First it was intentionally altered by Russia. Intentionally, and think of the problems that were solved. I've often thought of, because, the first image of a lecture I once gave, actually I had an invitation once to Holy Blossom Temple in Toronto. My first invitation of that sort. And it was from Rabbi Dov Marmur. And he said to me, you may have a hostile audience. And I said, I'm not worried. He said, you don't sound worried, why not? And I said, no. I start off by saying my fellow Canadians. And that's how it went. And I was describing, Poland post-war. You've got a nation of traumatized people psychologically, physically. How many one-legged survivors? People missing one leg, missing one arm, blind in one eye, or maybe totally blind. I said, this is the scene. In the meantime, their hospitals have been seriously damaged, if not destroyed, and half their doctors are dead. Do you get grief counseling? Do you have some compassionate person coming in to help? No, you have the NKVD. I said, think about that. And then you have, worse than the overall Polish tragedy, you've got the Jewish tragedy. So you have survivors of death camps coming back and finding their whole world is gone. And in the meantime, the Soviet propaganda is telling them the Poles did it. That everything is the Pole. You know, it's, I said, think of it. Just think of this scenario. I mean, you couldn't write a script like this. Well, somebody could and did. But there it is. And this is not to ask for sympathy, but try to understand it. I mean, to me, it's all about understanding. You try, you know, because I've heard people randomly blame this person or that person or this group or that group for the original sin for the cancellation of Polish history lies with Russia. Well, Germany, I mean, they would have accepted, but Germany was nicely defeated, thank God. But so it's with Russia, and they're still denying it. Mm-hmm. You know, they're doing the same. In fact, they're using the same playbook this time around. And when this war started, I thought, oh, here they go again. And then I thought, God, I hope Ukraine does not get betrayed. Because, you know, I take nothing for granted. And I think this is when you say, would I do it in Polish? No, I think that communications are communications. Now, there are people like Radek Sikorski, well, okay, but I can't aspire to that. It was a pure joy listening to him at the monk debates. But he's one of a kind. Well, not one, but you know, there aren't many. There aren't many like him, and I don't aspire to that. And I don't think most of us, you know, can get to that. So that's so.
Okay, of our meeting, I would like to repeat this question that I already asked you. Who is Irene Tomaszewska?
So I will repeat something. I will quote a Polish poet, Julian Tuwim, when he said, I'm a Pole because I like it. I won't say it's because I like it. I will say I'm a Pole because it's fascinating.
Mrs. Tomaszewska, thank you very much for this wonderful conversation and for your hospitality.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm sorry I took so much of your time, but I warned you I talked too much.